Hello, AP Government. We are going to begin our first set of notes for Unit 2 on federalism. So our topic today is Introduction to Federalism, really what is it, and going over some of the powers. So just to give you guys an idea, here are our objectives that you will answer at the end of the video. So the first one is to explain how constitutional provisions have shifted the balance of power between the national and state governments and compare the types of governmental power. So those are our two big focal points for today. And as you can see below, I've kind of given you a preview of what I'm going to be talking about. So we're going to be talking about the interpretation of the 10th and 14th Amendments, various clauses of the Constitution, and then various powers as well, like exclusive, concurrent powers, things like that. So to jump in, I like to consider federalism this balance that you see here. Federalism really is this delicate balance of power. We have to think about where our founding fathers' brains were when they were creating our system of government, right? The context of this was right after the Articles of Confederation. How do we delegate the necessary powers to the national government so that we can address national needs, right? Especially when we couldn't, like with Shays' Rebellion. But how do we also maintain state sovereignty or independence and power? And that is going to be a huge concern for the anti-federalists, right? Brutus, as we've read, is really going to be curious about this, right? How can we make it so that states are the ones that are or retain power and are not simply absorbed by the federal government? Now, federalism itself, just as a review definition, is that sharing of powers between the national and the state governments. And remember how it compares to a unitary system is that a unitary system is where you have one entity that rules over many subdivisions. So unitary systems are like your monarchies and your dictatorships. And then remember, a confederacy is not federalism because confederacy is where smaller political divisions like states are the ones that have power over maybe like the federal government. So remember, we had a confederation under the Articles. So with federalism, we're seeing now that the national government has powers. The states have their own powers as well. And then there are powers that we see them sharing as well. This has evolved over time. Honestly, at the time when we were founding our country, the different needs of the 13 states really necessitated this federal system. Over time, as we've seen and we will see in this course, through laws and Supreme Court decisions, the lines between state and national government and jurisdictions have been blurred a little bit. And we're constantly trying to balance the authority between these two tiers of governments. Now, we do see 10, I know it's a lot, but we'll go pretty quickly, 10 constitutional provisions for federalism. So these are the 10 big things that really, we point to outline this federal system of government. The very first one is the Commerce Clause, and that is found in Article 1, Section 8. So this is a power of Congress, and it's a power to regulate commerce with other nations and among the several states. So we call this interstate commerce or interstate trade. And I want you to think commerce, not necessarily trade, but anytime there's an exchange or movement of goods. Okay. Now, this is going to give strength to the national government. As we will see over time, that power will increase even more. But remember, under the Articles, states were the ones that were responsible for commerce, and it was really, really chaotic. It really didn't go well. So this Commerce Clause gives that power to Congress, to the federal government, where it used to be with the states. And it has been interpreted over time, as we will see, to greatly expand federal power. All right, also in Section 8 of Article 1, we see the necessary and proper clause. And as we know, this gives Congress the power to make laws necessary to carry out its other powers. We also call this the elastic clause. And like think of it like an elastic, it gives some flexibility in legislating. And this is also going to give power really to the federal government. Anti-federalists were afraid of this clause because they interpreted it as giving way too much power, right? What's to say that the federal government can't just make any law to violate the rights of the people or the states? Now, this power goes beyond the powers that are listed in the Constitution, right? This is not specific. Commerce, pretty specific. This is very vague. And for that reason, it does expand federal power. Okay. We also call these the implicit or implied powers simply because it does not list anything specific in that clause. Third, we have Article 1, Section 9, and that is the section that denies powers to Congress. So this is an example of limited government. We placed limits on a part of our government. Really, this is giving power to the state governments when you think about it, right? Because it's saying Congress cannot do this. Congress cannot, restrain habeas corpus. They cannot pass bills of attainder or ex post facto laws. So it is giving a little bit more power to the states by denying the federal government the power to do those certain things. All right, then we have Article 1, Section 10. So we're still in the legislative article, but this is the article that denies powers to states. Now, this is seeing kind of that balance, that shift in power here, because just like Article 9 gave power to the states, this is going to give power back to the federal government a little bit, because it's saying states cannot enter into treaties, only the national government can. States cannot coin money. States cannot tax imports. So that is going to give a little bit of, as we will see, supremacy to that national government. I just listed out the examples. I'm sorry, I'll say them again if you didn't catch them. But remember, states cannot form treaties with other countries, coin money, tax exports. We do see a couple of provisions for federalism in Article 4. This is really like the federalism section of the Constitution. And that first provision is the Privileges and Immunities Clause. Right? Article 4 is really responsible for defining relationships among the states, which was much needed after the Articles of Confederation. And really the first one is going to be this Privileges and Immunities Clause. This prevents a state from treating citizens from other states in a discriminatory manner. The purpose of this clause really was to facilitate the unification of now all of these independent states into one federal nation. So this does prevent a lot of discrimination between states as citizens of states. Article 4 also has an extradition clause, and an extradition clause obligates states to deliver captive fugitives, back to the state where they committed the original crime. So, a state cannot harbor a fugitive. I don't know if you've ever heard that. But it is a responsibility of the state to send them back to the state where the crime was originally committed. So that is kind of, again, defining or outlining the relationships between states. We also have the full faith and credit clause in Article 4, which we've talked about before, but this says that states must regard and honor the laws in other states. So again, this is like my marriage license, this is driver's licenses, things like that. Again, this was a huge concern for the states. Once the new Constitution was being written, they wanted to make sure that their laws that they had in place were going to be recognized and honored. Now, moving on to Article 6. Article 6 in the Constitution is the Supremacy Clause, and this places national law, treaties, and presidential actions above state authority. Again, shifting that power to the national government, big time here, right? Unless federal actions violate the Constitution, states can't disregard them. So this really puts the national government, the federal government, kind of at the forefront of power. Now, on the flip side, we have the 10th Amendment, which is going to preserve states' rights. Under the Articles and even beforehand, states were the ones that were involved in issues that people dealt with on a daily basis. They were the ones that were impacting citizens closely. And the Founding Fathers, and especially those anti-federalists, wanted to keep that this way. So the 10th Amendment preserves those states' rights. So the powers not delegated to the United States are reserved to the states. And then the 14th Amendment, again, is going to shift that balance of power back to the federal government. And what the 14th Amendment does, we'll see this being passed after the Civil War, but it establishes citizenship and requires states to guarantee privileges and immunities and prevents the denial of equal protection of the laws. So, right, we just talked about with the Supremacy Clause, how the national law is above states, right? Now with the 14th Amendment, which is a federal amendment, states can no longer violate privileges and immunities of people of color, for instance, or minorities, and they cannot deny them equal protection of the laws. So that is going to shift a little bit of power back to that federal government. So we are now going to talk about the types of governmental powers. And I have this Venn diagram here for you as a visual because I like to present the types of powers that we see in this Venn diagram. So we're going to see three types. You can think of it like this circle or this part of the circle is going to be what the national government can do. There are powers that only the states can do, right? But just like a Venn diagram, there is an overlapping section in a federal system, and there are powers that both the state and national governments have. So we're going to take a look at those as well. Now, our first type of power has many different names, as you see. So please know that these are synonyms for one another. But these are, the delegated, exclusive, enumerated, expressed, those all mean kind of the same thing. But really, these are powers that are only given to the national government. And these are outlined in the Constitution. We see that as being like the enumerated or expressed version of these words, or they are maybe assumed to exist, like the necessary and proper clause. This was a response, again, under the Articles of Confederation, to the need for national consistency across state lines, right? Think currency. All of the states before had different currencies. We need a exclusive power, a delegated power to the national government to coin money, so that way we have consistency across all states. Now, other examples of these delegated exclusive powers to the national government, military, right? That is only the national government declaring war. International and interstate commerce, that is only the federal government. Immigration, coining money. Anything really that we're going to take a look at in Article 1, Section 8, that's going to be one of these powers. Now, on the other side of our circle, we have the powers that are exclusively given to the states. We call these reserved powers. These are powers that are maintained by the state governments because, remember, they were really the ones that had these powers originally under the Articles of Confederation. And we see this being solidified by the 10th Amendment. Now, there really is nothing specifically listed in the Constitution. The way the 10th Amendment is worded is it really says as long as it's not given to the national government or denied to the states, it is reserved to the states. So there really is nothing specific. But just some examples of some reserved powers would be education, prison systems, elections, marriage laws, regulating health and safety. So think COVID, right? All of these states have had different measures of mask mandates and lockdowns and things like that. Speed limits, driving laws, that is all reserved to the states. And then finally, we have concurrent powers. So concurrent powers are where like the Venn diagram overlaps. This is where the national government and the states share power. So when we think of examples of this, there are really a big few of them. Levy taxes. Okay, that's probably the big one. If you ever look at a paycheck, you'll see that your money unfortunately goes away to the federal government, the state government, and probably local governments as well. Other concurrent powers: defining crime, establishing courts, enforcing laws, right? Those are things that both the national and state governments share. Now, I want to talk about a case study because we've been mentioning this like balance of power, and that can actually cause some tension or a tug of war, so to speak, between our national and state governments. So the case study that I want to talk about is the Defense of Marriage Act that was passed in 1996. And what this was a federal law that defined marriage as between one man and one woman. Now, that's a federal law. But you have to remember now that states, as we just talked about, are reserved the power over defining marriage and moral laws. So this definitely created a lot of conflict and tension up until it was finally resolved in 2015. Now, because states have to honor that full faith and credit clause, right? They have to honor the laws of other states. States generally honored marriage laws, but starting in the 21st century, when some states began legalizing same-sex marriage, other states expressly refused to recognize those marriages of those states. So they basically were refusing that full faith and credit. Some states rewrote their marriage laws and added amendments to mimic the federal Defense of Marriage Act. This is really going to put Article 4 in direct conflict with that 10th Amendment and national supremacy. Because like I said, technically the full faith and credit clause requires states to honor the laws of others. But the 10th Amendment grants states the rights to define marriages within its own borders. Now, we're going to see kind of a battle rage on over the years up until 2015 with a court case called Obergefell v. Hodges, which we'll talk about frequently in the course. But this basically was the Supreme Court case a couple of years ago that outlined same-sex marriage as guaranteed under the Constitution. So that was a strain between national and state power that was put to rest, but just wanted to show you how these can come into conflict. Now, there are some advantages to federalism, and one of the advantages is that there are multiple access points to increase opportunities for participation. And what I mean by that is, right, when you have not just a federal government, you've got state and local as well, that gives you many different positions to vote for, right? You can vote for local, state, and national policies, policymakers. So that gives more opportunities to influence policy as a citizen. States, as an advantage to federalism, can make policy that is specific to their individual needs. So an example of this, think regional and think like weather and how the weather is different in between the states. So for example, Florida and coastal regions like the East Coast, they really have to think about having plans and policies in place for hurricane evacuation. Ohio does not need to worry about that, right? We're not near an ocean. What we need to focus on might be tornado evacuation, things like that. Colorado doesn't need a hurricane policy, but it needs to think of something about maybe snowstorms, avalanches, things like that. Think California even versus Ohio, right? California is plagued with earthquakes and fires. We don't really have to worry about those policies. What we need to worry about, like I said, would be maybe tornadoes. So states can make those policies specific to their individual needs. States can make policy without a national consensus, right? That gives a little bit of flexibility, even if there's not a nationwide agreement on what to do about a certain policy. States can go ahead and make their own. And another positive is that the national government can make a uniform policy when it is necessary, right? That is really the purpose of that supremacy clause, to, make the country united when necessary in certain events and with certain issues, especially like the military, international relations. And the fifth advantage is states can serve as something that we call laboratories of democracy. And what this means is that federalism allows states to really experiment with new policies, and then other states and the national government can observe the effects, the ramifications of those policies, and choose whether they will reject or implement a similar policy. So the best example that you probably might already be thinking would be the legalization of marijuana, starting in really Colorado, then moving to Washington State, and now even trickling down to like areas of Cincinnati, where it's been decriminalized, right? So other states are looking at how this is going in these areas. The federal government is also paying attention, right? Is this something that is manageable? Does it increase crime? Does it decrease crime? What is happening at a social and economic level? So the national government and other states can kind of weigh those pros and cons when it comes to these kind of experiments. So that can serve as a positive as well. Now, disadvantages of federalism, there are a few, and they are pretty big. In a system like this, there are bound to be some disadvantages. So the first one is that it is tougher for the national government to make unified policies, because when there is, it has to be a consensus. And what happens in federalism is that since states are the ones that are making their own, laws about a lot of things, there's a lot of confusion, or there can be a lot of confusion surrounding policies throughout the country, right? Now that we have the Supreme Court decision ruling on same-sex marriage, it's a little bit easier. But before then, the laws were varied from state to state, and it did get kind of confusing. We're seeing this right now with legalizing marijuana, right? Is it legal? Is it not? It depends on where you are, which makes it very confusing. At times, states' rights may be used to perpetuate discrimination. It kind of goes into that majority rule, minority rights, excuse me. States might have a majority that are going to use their power to discriminate against a minority. So that can be a disadvantage of federalism. And then also, when you have different powers and they're being shared like this, there can be fights over responsibility, like who's responsible for paying for certain things, and accountability as well, right? There are so many different policies at so many different levels. How do you keep the group accountable if maybe a policy fails? One example of responsibility, if you guys are familiar with the Brent Spence Bridge that connects Ohio to Kentucky, that thing is breaking a little bit. There's it's old, it needs repair. However, there is currently a fight going on about who's responsible for paying for that actual repair, right? Is it Ohio? Is it Kentucky? The bridge spans both, right? And technically the Ohio River, if you didn't know, is owned by Kentucky. So should Kentucky be the one to pay for it since it crosses their river? Kentucky says no, obviously, and Ohio is kind of fighting back. So we do see a lot of this kind of confusion still arise, even with federalism. Okay? So remember, your objectives were to explain how constitutional provisions have shifted the balance of power between the national and state governments. You do not have to give me all of them, guys. Try to give me 2 for each. So 2 that have shifted power to the national government and 2 that have shifted power to the state governments, because otherwise that's a lot. And then compare the types of governmental powers. So we talked about 3 types of governmental powers in this video. Please compare them. So if you have any questions, please let me know. Send me an email, talk to me in class, and I look forward to reading your responses. I'll talk to you guys soon.